Let us settle in now, in the quiet hush of evening, as we begin a gentle journey through the history of an object so common that it waits every day at the edge of our plates. The fork, a simple tool, is often overlooked, but its story is a long one, winding slowly through centuries and across continents. Imagine, if you will, a time before forks were known, when people gathered around low tables, their meals warmed by firelight, and they reached for their food with hands, knives, or sturdy wooden spoons. In these early days, the act of eating was tactile and direct, and food was often shaped to be grasped easily: chunks of bread, cuts of meat, and little morsels that could be pinched between fingers. There is something quietly intimate about these scenes, about hands breaking bread and passing it to friends or family. And yet, as societies began to grow and meals became more elaborate, there arose a need for new tools, not just for convenience, but for etiquette and cleanliness. The fork's arrival was slow and subtle, not the grand debut of a bold invention, but rather a gradual appearance, shaped by the habits and tastes of many peoples over many years. The earliest forks, it seems, were not for eating at all. Archaeologists have uncovered slender, two-pronged implements from ancient Egypt, Persia, and Greece, but these were tools of the kitchen and the hearth, used to hold meat steady while it was carved, or to lift food from the flames. Imagine a cook, thousands of years ago, tending a small fire, using a bronze fork to turn sizzling pieces of lamb. In these moments, the fork was a helper, not yet invited to the dining table. In the Roman Empire, too, there were forks, but they were rare and specialized, sometimes used for serving, sometimes for picking up delicacies like olives. The average Roman, though, ate with fingers and knives, as did most people across Europe for centuries to come. The fork's journey to the table would take time, and it would require more than just practical need. It would need a shift in how people thought about eating, and about what it meant to share a meal. It was in the lands of the Byzantine Empire that the fork first began to make its quiet entrance onto the dining table. The Byzantines, living in the great city of Constantinople, were known for their refinement and their love of elaborate banquets. Here, forks were sometimes used at courtly feasts, delicate two-pronged pieces made of silver or gold, reserved for the nobility. There is a story, told in old chronicles, of a Byzantine princess named Maria Argyropoulina, who married the Doge of Venice in the 11th century. When she arrived in Venice, she brought with her a set of elegant forks, and at her wedding feast, she used them to eat sweetened fruits and candied meats. The Venetian guests watched in astonishment, and later some were scandalized. To many, the fork seemed strange, even decadent. Why, they wondered, would anyone spurn the use of hands, given by God, in favor of such a tool? In the years that followed, the fork was sometimes seen as an affectation, a sign of foreignness or even arrogance. Yet quietly, almost unnoticed, the idea began to spread. Perhaps there was something appealing about this new way of eating. For centuries, the fork remained rare in most of Europe, appearing only at the tables of the very wealthy or the very curious. In Italy, however, the fork found a more welcoming home, especially in the city-states of the north. By the late Middle Ages, Italian nobles had begun to use forks more regularly, especially when eating pasta, which could be difficult to handle with just a knife and spoon. The early forks of Italy were still simple, with two long, widely spaced prongs, shaped to spear pieces of food or twirl strands of noodles. It was not just a matter of practicality, though. Forks became a symbol of sophistication and good manners, a way to keep hands clean at the table, especially when sauces and oily dishes became popular. There are records of sumptuary laws in some Italian cities, which restricted the use of certain tableware to the upper classes. So the fork was not just a tool, it was a marker of status, and its presence on the table spoke quietly of taste, refinement, and the slow spread of new habits. Even as the fork found a place in Italian households, it was slower to catch on elsewhere. In France, for much of the Renaissance, the fork was viewed with suspicion, considered unnecessary or even a feat. French diners preferred their trusty knives and used a piece of bread in the left hand to push food onto the blade. The English, too, were slow to adopt the fork. There are stories of English travelers visiting Italy in the 16th and 17th centuries and writing home with bemused accounts of the strange eating customs they observed. Men and women, rich and poor, lifting food to their mouths with a curious little tool. One Englishman, Thomas Coryat, wrote a travel book in 1611 after a journey through Italy. He described the fork in detail and confessed that he had begun to use one himself, though he was mocked for it upon his return home. The fork, at this time, was still a novelty, a subject of jest and curiosity, and only gradually did it begin to appear on more tables, as travelers brought the custom back from abroad. As the centuries turned, small changes began to appear in the design of the fork. The earliest table forks, as we have seen, had just two long prongs, which were well suited to spearing, but not so convenient for picking up softer or more delicate foods. In the 17th and 18th centuries, craftsmen in France and England began to experiment with different shapes, adding a third prong and then a fourth. The four-tined fork that we know today emerged slowly as artisans realized that the extra prongs made it easier to scoop up peas, hold slippery fish, or twirl spaghetti. The design of the fork was not just about function, but also about comfort in the hand, balance, and beauty. The handles became more ornate, sometimes decorated with silver filigree or mother of pearl. In grand houses, each course might require its own special fork, one for fish, another for dessert, yet another for oysters. But in simpler homes, a single well-made fork would serve for every meal, passed down from parent to child, polished and cherished. By the 18th century, the fork had become a familiar sight in the dining rooms of Western Europe. In France, the court of Louis XIV set the standard for manners and table settings, and the fork was now considered an essential part of the proper place setting. Etiquette books gave careful instructions for its use, how to hold a fork, when to switch it from one hand to the other, and how to rest it on the plate when finished. In England, the fork became associated with civility and modernity, and as trade expanded, English-made cutlery began to appear on tables in the American colonies. In these years, the fork lost much of its aura of strangeness and became part of everyday life, an ordinary companion at every meal. Yet in rural areas and among the working classes, old habits persisted. Many people still ate with knives, spoons, and fingers, especially when dining in the fields or at simple wooden tables. The fork was not yet universal, but its steady spread was unmistakable, shaped by countless small choices in kitchens, workshops, and markets across the world. The story of the fork in America is a quiet one, marked by gradual change rather than sudden revolution. In the earliest colonial settlements, forks were rare, and most people ate as their ancestors had, using knives and spoons carved from wood or bone. Forks began to appear in larger numbers after the American Revolution, as trade with Europe increased and the new nation's prosperity grew. In the inventories of wealthy households, there are references to silver forks. stored carefully in locked chests, brought out for special occasions. For many families, a fork was a precious possession, sometimes brought out only for guests or Sunday dinners. Children learned to eat with what was available, and sometimes a single fork would be shared by several people, passed around the table as needed. The fork's slow journey into everyday life was shaped by thrift, practicality, and gradual acceptance, more than by fashion or etiquette. As the 19th century unfolded, the Industrial Revolution brought new possibilities. Factories in Sheffield, England, and other centers began to produce forks on a large scale, using new methods to work steel and silver. Suddenly, forks became affordable for more people, and their designs became standardized. The typical dinner fork now had 4 tines, gently curved to cradle food and polished smooth to the touch. Catalogs offered sets of matching cutlery for newlyweds or households, and advertisements promised that a good fork could last for generations. In America, too, factories produced forks by the thousands, and soon even modest homes had a drawer set aside for knives, forks, and spoons. The fork's quiet revolution was nearly complete, but there were still small variations, regional preferences for shape or size, or special forks for serving pickles, cake, or salad. Even as the fork became commonplace, it retained a sense of quiet dignity. In everyday life, the fork played its part in countless small rituals. Children learned to hold a fork properly, first in chubby fists, then with careful fingers, watched over by patient parents or grandparents. In farmhouses and city apartments, people set their tables with care, laying forks to the left of the plate, tines up or down according to local custom. The fork became a silent companion to conversation, laughter, and the sharing of food. At picnics, travelers packed sturdy forks alongside bread, cheese, and fruit, while in fine restaurants, waiters carried trays of gleaming silverware to each new table. There were mishaps too, forks dropped on the floor, or accidentally bent in a moment of carelessness. Yet, for the most part, the fork simply did its work, day after day, meal after meal, a small but steady presence in the quiet drama of daily life. Some people have wondered from time to time why the fork has 4 tines and not 3 or 5. The answer lies in small details. 4 tines provide the right balance between piercing and scooping, and the spaces between let food slip free without sticking. Over time, special forks were invented for different foods. Small forks for seafood, broad forks for serving meat, dainty ones for desserts. In some cultures, forks took on new shapes, a broad, flat fork for noodles in Japan, or a long-handled fork for fondue in Switzerland. Yet everywhere, the basic form remained much the same, shaped by quiet experiment and daily use. The fork's story is not one of grand invention, but of slow evolution, shaped by the hands of countless ordinary people, each making small adjustments, each seeking a little more ease or comfort at the table. Today, the fork seems almost invisible, so familiar that we rarely think about it. Yet its history is woven into the fabric of our everyday lives, a testimony to the slow, patient work of generations. As we reach for a fork at breakfast or dinner, we are linked, quietly and without ceremony, to the cooks of ancient Egypt, the princesses of Byzantium, the pasta eaters of Renaissance Italy, and the factory workers of Sheffield. The fork has passed from hand to hand, from feast to picnic, from palace to farmhouse, carrying with it the silent memory of 1,000 meals. Its story is not dramatic, but it is rich with small details. The feel of polished metal, the sound of tines against a plate, the quiet satisfaction of a meal shared with others. And so, as the evening settles around us, we might pause for a moment to notice the humble fork, to remember its long journey, and to find a gentle pleasure in the simple rituals of the table. So as we draw our story to a close, let us rest in the gentle knowledge that even the smallest things have histories worth telling. The fork, with its four tines and its quiet presence, reminds us that everyday objects are shaped by many hands over many years in countless small and unnoticed ways. There is comfort in this, in the steady passage of habits from one generation to the next, in the quiet company of tools that make our lives a little easier. And as we set our forks down at the end of another meal, we might feel a quiet gratitude for the inventors and the artisans, the cooks and the children, the travelers and the storytellers who carried the fork story forward, one bite, one meal, one peaceful evening at a time.